Hello and welcome everyone to Ananke's Women in Literature Festival. I am absolutely delighted to welcome our honored guests, Huda Fakhreddine, Jehan Bseiso. Jehan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and Leila Aboulela. And apologies, Leila, if the pronunciation is a bit wonky. So welcome everyone. I'd like to begin with telling you all about what this panel is about. The panel is titled Footprints on the Sands of Time, Arab Women in Literature vis-a-vis War, Resilience, Exile, and Identity. This session focuses on a conversation about Arab women in literature and will shed light on the prevailing perspectives about gender and race in light of the so-called end of the colonial era and birth of modern wars, conflict, and world politics. This session will discuss the evolution of literature by women in the context of resilience, exile, tackling gender inequalities, and how especially man-made conflict has weaponized gender. It will further explore exilic identities and women's subjugation, where each panelist will share perspectives on how storytelling, both fiction and poetry, has been enriched through diasporic voices of resilience and solidarity. And with us today is Huda Fakhreddine. Huda's work focuses on modernist movements or trends in Arabic poetry and their relationship to the Arabic literary tradition. She's interested in the role of Arabic qasida as a space for negotiating the foreign and the indigenous, the modern and the traditional, and its relationship to other poetic forms such as the free verse poem and the prose poem. She's the author of Metapoiesis in the Arabic Tradition and the Arabic Prose Poem, Poetic Theory and Practice. She is the co-translator of Lighthouse for the Drowning, The Sky That Denied Me, and Come Take a Gentle Stab, selections from Salim Barakat. Her translations of modern Arabic poems have appeared in Banipal, World Literature Today, Nimrod, Arab Lit Quarterly, and I'm unable to pronounce this. Huda, can you help me with this?
Asymptote.
Right.
But we
Asymptote.
Yeah.
Among others. Her book of creation nonfiction titled Zaman Saghir, Tehet Shams, Thania, A Small Time Under a Different Sun, was published by Dar al-Nahdha, Beirut in 2019. She is co-editor of Middle Eastern Literature and an editor of the Library of Arabic Literature. So welcome, Huda.
Thank you, Sabin. Thank you.
Jehan Bseiso is a Palestinian poet, researcher, and aid worker. Her co-authored book, I Remember My Name, is the Palestine Book Awards winner in the creative category. She is the co-editor of Making Mirrors, writing by and for refugees. Jehan has been working with Medicine Sans Frontiers or Doctors Without Borders, MSF, since 2008. Welcome, Jehan. Leila Aboulela is the first ever winner of the Khan Prize for African Writing, nominated 3 times for the Orange Prize, now the Women's Prize for Fiction. She is the author of numerous novels, including Bird Summons, The Kindness of Enemies, The Translator, a New York Times notable book of the year, Minaret and Lyrics Alley, which was fiction winner of the Scottish Book Awards. Her collection of short stories, Elsewhere, Home, won the Saltire Fiction Book of the Year. Leila's work has been translated into 15 languages, and her plays, The Insider, The Mystic Life, and others were broadcast on BBC Radio. She grew up in Khartoum, Sudan, and now lives in Aberdeen, Scotland. Welcome, Leila. So I would like to begin with a question. to all three of you. And it is, doing this research for the panel, I came across so many intriguing threads. And I wanted to ask you all, do you believe female literary figures from within the region as well as the diaspora have dismantled the stereotypical notion of the Arab woman in terms of their identity, their societal role, their subjugation, as well as resilience? We'll start with Huda, alphabetically.
Well, this is a big question. And I think my small answer is going to be this. Some of them have. So I would like to begin by resisting generalizations. And one way of, recognizing writing is by not lumping, all of women writers do this or all of male writers do that. I think an artistic and an aesthetic and a literary approach, not an anthropological or a historical approach to writing, is one that recognizes each writer as their own intervention in a tradition, intervention in the language's memory, and intervention in what we call world literature, whatever that means. That's a more problematic term. So when it comes to Arab women, I think the most successful Arab women writers are the ones who do not label themselves and do not pigeonhole themselves and do not, forego their writing before it takes its chance. And, the arc of a work is never complete unless it reaches the reader and maybe comes back. So let's begin by resisting generalizations and labels like that and recognize failures and successes of Arab women writers, both.
True. Jehan?
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say I completely agree with that. And I would say that it is much more productive and much more fruitful to define yourself for something and not in negation against a stereotype. And we know that these stereotypes are not true, they're not complete, and as Huda mentioned, they're quite reductive, rendering like a very simplified notion. And I think that the range of Arab women writing alone challenges these stereotypes. So if the question is, is there a resistance? I think that we should be more looking at the range of writers and the range of writing and letting that inform the picture, and to get out, exactly as Huda said, of these pigeonholes and these labels and these stereotypes.
Over to you, Leila.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that things do get better. I think if you ask the question in a sense of wanting a yes or a no answer, have we succeeded in dismantling? I would probably just say no, we haven't. Because it's very difficult to dismantle things that are so intrinsic, so deep-rooted, so vulnerable, and like we could think that we dismantle it, and then suddenly something is going to happen, something in the news, and then we're back again to square one, back again to the old stereotypes, as if nothing has happened. So it's a kind of a two-step forward, two steps, two steps forward is one step back. So that is a kind of a pessimistic way of looking at it. But when we look at the actual work now that is available, there's so much range now than there used to be 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So many writers, women writers, are producing work. The younger generation especially is very impressive. I recently read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. She's a wonderful young Palestinian writer. I highly recommend the book. It's just out now. She's someone who's very young, and she is Western. So when you read her writing, she's not writing from she is of course writing from an Arab perspective, but she's also writing from a Western perspective. So she's comfortable within the two worlds. There's also Noor Naga, who's got a new novel called If an Egyptian can't speak English. That's very nice, very refreshing, very, you read it and you're sort of delighted and enjoying the kind of the new ways that the younger generation are looking at these divides between the West and the Arab world in a way that maybe the previous generations didn't. So it's the scene is very vibrant, and there's so much going on, and there's so many platforms now. We mentioned Banipal, and there's Arab Lit, and these places weren't available 30 years ago. And so 30 years ago, there were only one or two Arab women and all the spotlight was on them. And they had to somehow either represent, which is a problem in itself, or they had to, please the West or whatever. So now the situation is much more democratic, and there is a wider range of writers, and I think that this is a good thing.
If I may add to this,
Please do. Yes, please.
Following on both Jehan and Leila's responses, I think, yes, if the short answer is required, it's going to be no, Leila, but maybe we can answer yes based on what you mentioned, both of you, the range, the diversity of platforms, and what you mentioned when you said she's Palestinian but also Western. I think what we've succeeded in doing is deconstructing the dichotomy of East and West. Look at us. I mean, Sabin, you're in Dubai. Leila, you're in Dubai now, but usually you're based
Scotland,
in the West, right? A Palestinian in Cairo. I'm Lebanese in Philadelphia. I mean, Arab writing, both male and female, now represents an experience that's more difficult to categorize. And writers are also thinking of themselves as active in the languages they write in, often other than Arabic, or when they are other than Arabic. So dividing lines are blurred, and generalizations is becoming more difficult. That's a success, I think, in opening up and expanding the categories that were in the past used to restrict and to flatten and reduce. We're going to go back to these words, and generalize and essentialize. So there's breaking out of these categories, and that's a success.
Indeed, you're absolutely right. And while the dichotomy, or these divisions are being blurred from a writing perspective, talking about the readership, or talking about the perceptions of West, how does that come in? You see the writing, you see the beautiful fusion, everything. How is that reception by, for example, the Western white reading audience?
I think it's hard. I'll just jump in here maybe to say it's hard for us, or at least for me, to talk about the perception of a white Western audience. But I can say that the struggles to get published are still very real for a lot of non-Western voices. And Leila has mentioned a few incredible writers, and there are many more as well who struggle to get the word out there. I think that there is still a tendency to for example, Arya Aber is an Afghan poet who writes in the US, and she has talked about the difficulty of getting poetry out. She does do it, but the difficulty of getting poetry out that doesn't respond to the image and the topic of, Afghan woman in diaspora. She wants to write about a whole range of topics, and somehow she sometimes talks about being restricted. And again, this touches Huda's point on being flattened and restricted. So I think it's there is still a tendency to look for exoticized, simplified narratives, but that is being challenged every day with every incredible publication that manages to make its way.
I can attempt a response from my tiny little corner as an academic, and I work in a problematic entity on campus that's called Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. I'm allergic to terms like Middle East, MENA, SWANA. Near East is one of the older ones, more openly Orientalist. And the origins of this field of study in the United States was very much Orientalist. It essentialized this region in the world and assumed and generalized and made sometimes racist conclusions that would, lump together traditions and ethnicities and languages into one thing that was easily palatable, as Jehan said, to a Western audience. Today, I think we academics, although our world is small and very slow in the progress that it achieves, the one positive change I notice around me is that there are more people like me in the field, who are in this field of study, who are from the region, who are native speakers of the languages, and who bring an experience to the academic approach or perspective. And the Western gaze, or the reception of the white reader is the term you used, Sabin, is no longer central or focal as it used to be. We are directing ourselves in a different direction. So for me personally, it means a lot that my work, which I also view as creative, my work as a reader and as a critic, and I think that is also an intervention in recharting or retelling the history of Arabic literature, both in Arabic and in the diaspora. It means a lot to me that it's received in the Arab world. I think of Arab readers as my first audience, and that's why I take translation very seriously as both a creative work and a critical intervention. So I think this shift, the idea that we're not always justifying ourselves and explaining ourselves, with introductions and footnotes and indices as used to be, that our writing can be works of art that stand on their own, in their own right, and then whatever deductions or conclusions that are to be taken from them are the reader's responsibility. It's not our responsibility as writers to cater and to appease and to comfort anxieties about us and about our region or our traditions.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point that it's not all about the white gaze, that even within the Arab literary circles, let's say, there is a lot going on. There's almost a revolution going on. It used to be that the Arab writers was Levant, the Egypt, Syria, Lebanon. This was the Arab intellectual world, and everything else was a kind of the periphery. Mm-hmm. And now this is all being not threatened, but this has been expanded with the Gulf, entering the arena, a lot of the meetings, a lot of the prizes. The international Arabic Booker, for example, is held in Abu Dhabi. And that has kind of revolutionized the people who the kind of books that get mentioned. There's more interest in Africans who write in Arabic. Writers like Haji Jabir from Eritrea, Stella Gaetano from Sudan. These are writers who are African. They identify as African, and yet they are writing in Arabic, and so they are Arab writers. And so this is bringing in new worlds into what has been traditionally Arabic literature, as characterized by kind of the very city scene, sort of like Najib Mahfouz, let's say, the city, the very masculine, very intellectual, very leftist, and suddenly there's now other worlds coming into Arabic literature. So if you pick up a book, let's say Joka al-Harithi's novel, for example, Celestial Bodies, this is different than the kind of Arabic literature that is produced in the Levant or in Egypt. And she herself felt a kind of resistance from the traditional Arab center. She felt that she was an outsider as an Omani writer with winning a Booker Prize. It was considered in some circles as kind of controversial, that some Arab writers weren't 100% comfortable that the Booker, the international Booker, would go to an Omani woman. rather than someone from Lebanon or from Syria. So these things these exciting things are going on within the Arab world, within the Arab circle, let alone the kind of the white European gaze. There's actually quite a lot of dynamism going inside the Arab region. Yeah.
And just to say, this is why I think it's so important that we talk about these kind of examples, because it complicates the picture, and that we had a very simple, really black and white view with the focus on the Western white gaze that eclipsed an entire range of voices. And I completely agree that specifically, writers from Algeria, Morocco, also more those who write in French are now wanting their text translated in English and in Arabic to reach a wider audience. So yeah, completely agree with this.
And let me add to this and maybe take it back to Jehan, because as Leila said, yes, the Arab world that is also often included in Middle East or MENA, all these other problematic labels, is diverse and has its own tensions. It has its own dividing lines that are being crossed and blurred. And to add to the mix, the diaspora that is really engaged actively in recharting, retracing both what we mean geographically and historically by Arab world or Middle East or whatever other labels, and people writing in other languages, writers, both men and women, who write in other languages, but are informed by echoes of Arabic. Their creative reference is Arabic, but their intervention or contribution is in English, as our guests here, or in French or other neo-colonial languages. That's a very interesting and fruitful and productive relationship that is in itself a form of resistance. So to include the diaspora into what we now call the Arabic tradition, the Arabic literary tradition, to include works in other languages is unsettling, it's subversive, but it's very fruitful and reaffirming. It really it keeps edges loose and allows margins to interact with whatever centers used to be more established and fossilized.
Even when the centers were more established, there was a history of global solidarities that I find has been eroded, and maybe that is finding its way a bit back, where there was for example, and maybe yes, indeed, it was aligned with a more leftist tradition. I'm thinking of Lotus, and I'm thinking of a lot of male writers that gathered around at the time, and always I wondered, where are the women in these tellings? I felt quite a gap, but I feel like there used to be a time when there was a bit of a borderless view. And then it became entrenched and incredibly bordered. And I feel slowly right now we are challenging once again those borders by including the diaspora, which for me, they defy geography. They carry multiple tongues, multiple passports, and they sit, they are at dis-ease wherever they go. And I think it's even, I don't know if you agree, but it's even more important to hear them out.
This is what, the universality of arts and, the written word is, this is how it should be, right?
And it's also the best resistance to history, because history is always monolingual and linear, and it leaves out more than it includes. Art, and especially literature, offer an alternate history that will reveal unveiled connections that often history obscures. Yes.
Absolutely. So going back to what Leila had said about one or two women writers being on the focus, And here I will talk about Nawal al-Saadawi, and I would love your opinion on that. Works of Nawal al-Saadawi, they're met with reverence as well as skepticism. And while some deem it groundbreaking and feminist, others label it. And there's an article that I read, Amal Amire's article, which basically says, her works are telling Western readers what they want to hear, who want to confirm existing stereotypes. And again, quoting Amal, this criticism may be coming from male critics hostile to al-Saadawi's feminism. Do the new generation of Arab female writers face the same challenges in terms of wary, suspicious, biased reception? How, in your opinion, does she or you as a writer navigate through such narratives?
Well, I think the Amira article is, it was true for its time, when it was published in 1996. I just think that there's been so much of a change since then. I think Nawal al-Saadawi's writing is more nuanced than the impression that she gave. I think that somehow she was manipulated by the media, or she allowed herself to be manipulated by the media. She came across as being very, sort of unreliable and kind of extreme. But when you read her work, it's very serious, and be very serious, very thoughtful, very, there's a lot of depth into it, and it's disappointing that this didn't come across in the later into interviews and this kind of thing. And there was a kind of a I felt that it just kind of got out of hand somehow. But Nawal al-Saadawi, I think, is also, I feel that she's important, and because she also challenged this. She was an outsider within, I think, the Arabic circles because of her humble beginning. She didn't come from a middle class, family. She wasn't, from a kind of, a city. She came from the countryside. She came from a poor background, and so she was in touch with the kind of the real people, if like to say. So there was something going on there in her battle within Arabic intellectual circles, and maybe she wasn't taken as seriously as she should have been, also because she was a woman. But at the time when she was writing and all that, there was this problem of that there weren't many people around her, and so she bore this brunt of being the one who had to represent. So we, as being young or whatever at the time, would say, "Oh, why is she giving this impression? Or people will think this about us." And then, in the West will use her then as a kind of, this is the only example they had in front of them at the time.
Huda, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Leila said. Nawal Saadawi is a trailblazer, and usually beginnings need to be jarring and shocking. We should not ask nuance of somebody who's breaking new soil, right? But you're right, Leila, when you go back and read her, she's much more nuanced than she's given credit for, definitely. And the media played a role. She also played a role in creating this persona for herself in her appearances in the media, just her mannerisms, the way she responded usually to critics. She played into this persona, but I don't personally blame her. I'm thinking of how brave and how unique the stances and the positions she took were for their time. And here we are going back to her and her legacy, which proves that it still has a lot to offer, more than the iconic, approach to it as something that's either to be revered or to be what was the word you used, Sabin? Criticized or thought of as a Western conspiracy or catering to. I mean, all revolutionaries or rebels are attempt to be claimed by one side or another because they're divisive, and it's necessary in the beginnings to do that. Our role now, generations later, or a generation or two later, is to go back and read her thoughtfully and see what the threads, where the threads of her work will take us, to build on it, and not just, go back and argue about how to label her. But there is a legacy here that we have been entrusted with and have to build on.
And she's widely read. She was read. I mean, I remember being a student in Khartoum University in the 80s, and we read her and we talked about her, and her books were available in Sudan. And every time I go back to Sudan now, her books are in the bookshops. So she has a wide appeal and a wide readership. It's not like that people weren't reading her. They were actually reading her. Yeah.
And you mentioned, Leila, something very important about her is that her background is different. She entered into the intellectual Arab world from a different door, an unexpected door, and her work, both as a in the medical field and the ethnographical part of her work with the real people, as you mentioned, was not what you expect of an Arab literary figure or a thinker to do. I mean, this hands-on, on the ground work was unexpected, and I think this gives a very different angle and impact to her work. So new things, groundbreaking things, are always hard to respond to initially, and they end up being either demonized or revered. But I think this is testament to the value of her intervention or contribution, which, again, here we are going back to. We still pause with her and account for her when we tell a story about women in the Arab world, about activism, about human rights, about equality for men and for women too. I mean, her work is wide-ranging in its relevance.
That's true.
And Huda, you said revolution. I think she was revolutionary. We cannot sum up Nawal al-Saadawi, but I think we can begin by saying that she was a revolutionary. And I mentioned, in our conversation that I had, an opportunity to listen to her in Dubai, I think 3-4 years ago. And, the way she spoke, the passion, I mean, it was mind-blowing, and it was a masterclass. And it was an experience that I cherish, and you learned so much, not just Nawal the writer, but the revolutionary, the trailblazer. So yeah.
And I feel like if part of the criticism is that she was, quote, catering to a Western audience or sensibility, I feel like that's kind of an imposed reading of her works. Like it's a lens that is put on her work rather than her work's maybe natural extension, because even if some parts of her work resonate with Western audiences, that doesn't mean that they were there in order to cater to them. And I still feel in this whole discussion that we are still giving the Western gaze, narrative, and voice far too much space, so.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. We've been conditioned to think that every critical, introspective turn to ourselves, to our tradition, to our history, is catering to the Western gaze. We have the right to be critical of our own histories and our traditions without being prompted by an outsider. And so most projects that cut deep in their critical view of their own history. We're not going to make this exceptionally about the Arabs as well. In every tradition, they are undermined with this accusation. It's catering to an outside imperative. I don't agree with that. I agree with Jehan. We should try to just limit the power of this gaze. And I agree with Leila. It's very difficult to do that because this is so ingrained. These are hundreds of years of looking westward. So I think our generation, there's a generation or maybe two that are shifting their gaze, and they realize they have a gaze too that they can direct to their own history, their own tradition, and the world. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't resist. So that means critique also. We should try to create critique of her work and allow voices critiquing it from the region to emerge without also kind of disallowing this, because it's exactly because of what you said, Huda, that we have the right to turn the gaze, we have the right to critique voices and writers from the region, and not to have this as something that is, from the outside in. So if there is criticism of her work, which there is, then space for that should also be created from the.
And I can't resist, because you've touched on a very sensitive chord for me. So I think of myself as a reader and critic, but often what's required of me here in this context, I'm often viewed as a native informant. I present the raw material, somebody else has the intellectual take on it. And my critical views are seen as if they're personal. First of all, they're not objective, they're not based on reading or on expertise, and that they are going to reflect on my view of the whole region, my whole identity, my whole belonging. We argue here and fight for a right to be critical, self-critical first, and then also critical of the world around us. And that's a very important thing. And the West or outsiders are not always standing between us and ourselves, whispering. No, we are. Yeah. I think Leila might have something to add.
I'm very aware though of the markets, of the publishers. The publishers are in the West. They are the ones who. So this is the problem. That where is the economics of all of this production? These books. It's still Western. We're not in. There isn't an independence. And so if I'm published in the West. And as you said, I care so much about what readers in Cairo think of me, or readers in the diaspora think of me. I care about them so much. But are they going to buy my books in enough sufficient amounts to keep my publishers publishing them? The answer is sadly not really. So this conspiracy theory of we're pandering to the Western reader, there is a truth in that, because the Western reader is the one who is actually buying the books. So as long as there is this economic problem, not problem, but as long as this dependence is taking place, and we haven't become independent, we haven't shifted the markets, we haven't shifted the magazine productions, we haven't I don't know. I was hoping that magazines like Banipal would continue and that they would get funding from the Arab world. A bookshop, Saki bookshop in London, why is it closing? All of these things, it boggles the mind. And you think, why is this happening? And it's very sad. And I think unless these things are resolved, and unless the Arab world puts money into that, as it has done with other things, non-academic and non-literally things, we are still going to be limping along.
Leila, you've really said something which I was thinking, while this conversation was going on, and Jehan said it, we're still talking about the Western gaze. And I was, thinking exactly the same thing, that, we're going back there. And is that our colon, we're out, we were not a colony anymore. But or we think that we're not, we still have that mindset. I don't know. But on the other hand, this is the exact same challenge that South Asians are also facing. We've got a panel on a topic, South Asian literature of mangoes and monsoons, and we're talking about these publishers in the West. They want, specific mentions and stereotypes and whatnot, but they want it on their terms. In order for a South Asian writer from within the region or the diaspora to be published. So that is, again, that there are similarities when it comes to the publishing, the economics of being published.
And they can't be disconnected from the economic world order. So it's just an extension. And I know that that's not what we're talking about here, but there's a reason people in the MENA or Swana or near fear, whatever we call it, would find, for example, the price of a book prohibitive, or would prioritize something else other than going to a literary circle. But it has to happen more and more. And if I want to be optimistic, I can say that we are more and more hacking some of those establishments where you find more and more non-Western, non-Euro, North American in the editorial line, behind that big publishing stamp. So you have more and more, the more those platforms existing, established, hegemonic as they are, get diversified. That's also how I see that we will be able to have a shot. And also the availability and the constant friction with reluctant readers, reluctant publishers, sometimes reluctant governments. If you would like to hold a book talk in Cairo, where I'm sitting today, the number of permissions we would need to get you is almost alone a reason not to do it. So there's a larger reality, but I think we need to continuously go into tension with it.
Yeah, I agree. So hacking and infiltrating, and highlighting the important role of editors and reviewers and translators, as well as readers who can maybe shift things, even if slowly. And maybe here's the moment to plug projects like Seagull Books. Look at where publishing is being taken to the other side of the world, and where world literature can be made from somewhere else other than where it has been usually been made. So there are some shining examples. We need so many more. And as Leila mentioned, hopefully entities and governments and institutions that have funding will start prioritizing, because this is really the frontier. This is the front line of whatever, challenges or struggles we have. This is where we stand a chance to succeed. If not economically, if not in other fields, it is here. And, telling a story and rewriting history and just shifting perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. So coming back to, the topic, works of literature from female writers poignantly portray the roles of women have played across, I'm a little intimidated to say the MENA region, Middle Eastern and African regions in terms of resilience, exile, and owning their identity. How would you assess this interplay between the individual, personal, and private with the public and collective, along with ethnic identities? How has it impacted Arab women's rights? Who would like to go first? Huda, I'm going to ask you.
Waiting for somebody else to go first, because I don't know, if you go back to the wording of your question, the word resilience makes me sit up straight and advocating, and I think I put it in the same category with words like humanizing, and I find these very problematic, and I think it's just a very heavy weight to put on the shoulders of writers, male or female, but maybe especially female in traditions that have been male dominated for centuries. And when you have one or two or three or a generation of women writing, and then you ask them for resilience, for humanizing, for it goes back to the problematics of representation. And here I'm going to quote a man, not a woman, but I think very relevant and resonant. Abdul Razak Gurna, when asked after the prize, how do you see yourself as an African writer? He said, I represent me. And that's, I think, the most effective, impactful, and maybe revolutionary thing to say for somebody coming from the global south, to say, I am me, and my experience, my take, my experimentation, my craft stands for itself, but in its wake, so much can be learned. And that's how, things as big and abstract as human rights can be changed. It's one work at a time, sometimes maybe one phrase at a time. When a writer sees themselves as owners of a craft, and that's where their changing of the world is going to happen. If they take that seriously, I think it can actually happen. But to burden writers, women and men, with these very heavy terms is unfair, especially for women. If you're trying to balance, since history is already unbalanced, it's a little bit unfair. But that's not a response to your important question. So I turn to my colleagues here.
Leila, do you have something to add?
I think the reason people want writers to represent them is because they feel, or they felt, maybe now because of social media it's better, but they felt that they didn't have a way of giving their point of view across. So I remember, for example, being an old woman as I am, I remember in the 90s how much joy and pride Edward Said gave us when he used to speak, and in platforms, because we didn't have a voice. We couldn't reach the places he could reach. There was nothing. There was no internet. You couldn't write to the media. You didn't have Twitter. There was nothing. So we were completely cut off. And there was someone who speaks English so good, who's articulate, who, and it was just, I can't, you have to have been there to see the impact. So that is going away now, because people, I think, feel that they can have a voice, that they can have access to platforms where they can speak, whether it's TikTok or whatever. So there's less of this burdening of writers with the representation. But there was a time when it was important for people.
Yeah, so Solmaz Sharif says an Iranian American, I think she would say more Iranian than American, but okay, an Iranian American poet. In an interview, she mentions bad politics is bad writing. So at the same time, this kind of burden that Huda is mentioning of putting all of this on the writer and their work to represent and to advocate and to free, it is really, really too much. And it is possible to say these words represent me and they represent something bigger than me. But maybe if you're the one that says it, then you're already kind of ruining it. For me also, I think it's not always easy to speak from the politics of a place, because also we've been conditioned, and I'll say conditioned here, to think that kind of politics, dirty writing, right? Because it's supposed to be elevated, it's supposed to lift up. In some schools, it's supposed to be removed and neutral. And increasingly, at least for me, it's harder and harder to write something completely removed and neutral. At the same time, the boxes that are available also don't fit. So yeah, I don't know if I answered anything, but I want to join Huda also in being completely uncomfortable with the word humanize. I work in aid, and we talk about sometimes, humanizing. This story humanizes, our patients, and I find this incredibly uncomfortable. Not doing this.
I think I'm going to use another label by saying that, all these terms are actually desensitizing us, maybe by, saying that, talking about empathy and humanizing things. So, and Huda, coming back to your point about the writer representing himself, you quoted,
Herself.
yes. I think that's the best way. If I think about it, that's the best kind of writing there is. The writer herself or themselves, they won't have the burden of representation, but their stories or their writing will resonate with the reader, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I meant. I think it resonates more when it doesn't set out to speak for everyone. I mean, what is world literature if not a constellation of the most localized of literatures and traditions? And you don't become a world literature writer out in vacuum. I mean, the more relevant and resonant and relatable you are, it really depends on how unique and yourself you are. So definitely, I think it's just setting out this, assigning oneself a mission to speak for others, whether it's a group of people or an entire culture or an entire tradition. As I used that word earlier, it forgoes the arc of art. Art becomes collective necessarily. Poetry is always political, whether we like it or not. But I think when it sets out or it begins as politics, it ends up being bad writing. Whether it's good or bad politics, it ends up being bad writing. But real poetry is its own ontology. It's its own form of thought that is parallel to history, to philosophy, to religion. It doesn't complement them. It just rivals them or challenges them. And when it's true to its own self, the more true to itself it is, the more poignant and revolutionary it is, even if it's not on the surface. I believe that all art is committed art, even if it doesn't hold up a banner. And I think the local is being as local and as personal as possible is the way to resist all of these essentializing labels, but intervene in the collective and in the world, definitely. And to Leila's point, you're right. I mean, these regions that we're discussing that we belong to suffer from extreme lack of leadership or inspiration. Yes, we all look to people like Edward Said with pride, and we seek somebody to inspire and speak for us. And I think artists are the new leaders of in these regions, because I mean, we've lost hope in all other form of leadership. I speak as a Lebanese, and I've never felt so disappointed and disillusioned in my life. But I only find hope when reading young writers and poets and novelists who still find a doorway through language and its imagination to think about the world and rewrite it literally and in literature, to rewrite it. Yes, so representation happens, but it happens in the long term. It doesn't happen. It's not a launching point.
Absolutely. And talking about Edward Said, in one of his essays, Reflections on Exile, he writes that the experience of exile comprises of and I quote, unhealable rift between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home, adding that those in exile are in fact cut off from their roots, their land, their past. So that is what he wrote. But intriguingly, that's where the relationship between the exile and the homeland remains and exists. How would you respond to that?
So I'll start by saying this rootlessness that he describes, I think it's still a very powerful motivator in art. Although the world that he was writing from, also with the connectivity, with the possibilities to bridge, with the capacities that we have today, perhaps it was much more technically alienating before than it is now, which I think even puts, because of all of these kind of sometimes the artifice of connection or the appearance of connection, and rootedness, it becomes even more important to dig for roots and to try to find them and to reunite, the soul with the body, which is also what he says at some point. This, for me, the creativity through this pain of rupture, of exile, and the doorways that it opens to an understanding of this two being of a double consciousness, of being one foot in more than one place, and easy to navigate. I think that alone is creating incredible work out there. So it's not only, if I read parts of Edward Said, I can only see actually the pain, the alienation, the division of the self. But I think more and more there is a possibility to have a bit of a wholesome picture, no matter how fragmented, and some of it is mediated by all of these technologies and ways we have to come together, exactly like this call. But it doesn't heal, but it just has the appearance of healing.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
Well, I can add, maybe on a more positive note, definitely the experience of being uprooted or rootless, it's painful and it's hard to account for. But on a positive note, I mean, Mahmoud Darwish, near the end of his life, wrote a beautiful essay where he thanked exile. Because exile, this space in between, is also creative and fruitful. And there's something to be said about distance. As we were saying, Sabin, before the call, we said, when we leave our homes, we gain a perspective that was probably occluded when we were there. And our identities crystallize in different ways, in unique ways, when we, are far away and we realize connections that we probably didn't see when we were there. Our relationship, double consciousness is what Jehan said. Yes, we then gain a homeland that's imaginary, that somehow challenges or complements, or it creates this kind of productive, creative friction with the one in our memories. So there's a proliferation of consciousness that happens in this distance, in exile or migration. That doesn't deny how painful it is, and one spends one's entire life trying to do something with the pain, turning it into something else. But there's definitely perspective, there's definitely, a kind of knowledge that would not have been possible otherwise. And in that space, as painful as it might be, there are sparks that create great poetry and literature and art.
I mean, I started to write when I left Sudan, and so I know this firsthand. And I always believed that if I had stayed in Sudan, I wouldn't have become a writer, because I wasn't at all. I loved reading, but I didn't have an urge to write, and I was studying statistics, and I was going in a completely different direction. But then when I left Sudan and ended up in Scotland, this is when I started to write. So I know about this firsthand. And even though now I started off by writing about people who had moved from Sudan to the UK, I now moved on to write about other things. But always the characters are away from home. They seem somehow to be in a different place than their original home. So I can't get rid of that. I have to maybe challenge myself next time to see what it's like to write from a perspective of somebody who hasn't made this kind of move. I think also one of the sad things, not sad, but one of the things I realize and what keeps me writing is that my children, of course, they haven't been born with a hard drive of my memories. And so they don't know what I know. And so you have to kind of tell them these stories, because otherwise how would they know? And I think that all parents who make this move, they kind of seem to imagine that the child is going to know everything. They're going to be born knowing all these things, but we have to tell them these stories. So it becomes a responsibility almost of telling the stories.
maybe what I'm going to say, it might sound a bit prosaic, but aren't we as humans, migratory, and this is part of our DNA. So even if your children, they're, I mean, you tell them or they would know through you, but maybe it's in our DNA as well, the migratory aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know, but I think that I personally found it very difficult. And but I mean, some people respond better. Sometimes it's to do with the reason you left, whether it was a conscious decision or did you just fall into leaving, whether there was a sense of closure when you left. Did you really say goodbye? Do you have a health relationship going back home? I mean, you can kind of go through a kind of a psychology checklist to see whether whether this is a kind of a healthy transition or not. But in terms of fueling the art, then it did in my case, it did definitely, yeah.
And as Jehan, you said about rootlessness, maybe we are rooted because of our rootlessness. I'm just going round and round in circles. I don't know, just thinking out loud here. So my last question to all of you is for you to share your perspective on how storytelling, both fiction and poetry, has been enriched through diasporic voices of solidarity.
Well, I'll start if you'll allow me, but
Sure.
I'll also comment on the last bit of our conversation. So I read and write about poetry, and I pretend to write poetry sometimes. And I think poetry by nature is separation. Even if you don't leave your homeland, as a poet, you separate yourself. It is a form of exile. It's a form of stepping outside of experience and looking at it and at yourself from a distance. It's also poets strive to create another language within their languages. So it's also a step removed. So there's something about distance, about journeying. And here I remember the Abbasid poet, my favorite poet, Abu Tammam, who says, فَاغْتَرِبْ تَتَجَدَّدِ. So when you have writer's block, just go away and you'll be refreshed, and writing will come, or inspiration, when you leave, when you separate. So poetry, to me, is this separation. It's this perspective. It's this fresh, unexpected consciousness of things that are mundane and ordinary. And the story poetry tells, I think, is always resonant and new, and maybe sometimes shocking. And I find in it comfort. It is really the homeland that one carries everywhere. And in that, one can settle without fear of disappointment or disillusionment. I'm not sure if that's a response to your question, but it's definitely a plug for poetry and for a poetic approach. So I think what I strive to do in my work is to approach poetry on its own terms, because again, this relates to a lot that we've already said. Poetry can, and literature in general, can teach. It can offer information, but it's on its own terms, not one approached as a source of, or as a document, or as an anthropological record. And the stories that literature and art can tell are the most revolutionary, going back to that word, and they're the ones that really keep things open to new potentials and not fixed and flattened and reduced.
So I agree with everything Huda said so beautifully. It's and I just want to add, personally, for me as a poet writing in English, I asked myself a lot of questions, and I will share that for at least 6-7 years, it felt like every 2-3 years there would be a war on Gaza, which is originally where I come from. And where a place I've never visited. I've been able to go to Palestine thanks to speaking of diaspora, thanks to the fact that my mom took the plane 9 months pregnant to deliver me in the US, that I could eventually visit Palestine. But I wrote these Gaza poems for which, and they were literally called Gaza from the diaspora, because I wanted that distance to be communicated immediately, even at the title, because there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of fake proximity, there was a lot of chaos going around, and I wanted immediately to communicate the distance. A few years later, when I had a chance to be in Bethlehem University, and I was very nervous about reading some of those poems, because I was like, what am I going to do? Like, these are people, inside. Okay, they're not in Gaza, but how is this poem from the diaspora that even says it's from the diaspora in the title, reconsidering that, how is this even going to resonate with this group of people? And it did. And their reactions and the way that they reacted kind of was so reassuring, because for me, we put poetry in boxes and in places, and it's always bigger than what we think it is. And that's what also Huda was trying to say with the work goes to the reader and then back, and for me, I had a lot of questions about writing in English. I do translation. I'm translating currently a work from Arabic into English, but and writing from far, from distance. But it's something that I keep going back to, and the reactions confirm to me that it's something that needs to be done. Because at the moment, there are more people outside than inside in a lot of those places that we're writing about. So that vantage point is needed and has merit, and the poem is able to communicate much more than we think it does. So yeah.
Leila?
Well, as I mentioned, I've been, writing. All my writing is kind of about that, and I think that as time goes by, it's become more of finding connections. That I'm trying to find the connections between the place I left, which is Sudan, and the place where I made my new home, which is Scotland, and finding the historical connections, and then realizing that there's more of a connection than I saw than I had, thought of before. So it's not such a strange thing that I made this move. That it makes historical sense if one looks at the history. Then it becomes you understand better that your own situation. And I have done this through the writing, and also I find that my writing over the years, I'm being published now for more than 25 years. It kind of reflects the changes that have happened with the diaspora in the West, and throughout there was some very difficult years of the war on terror, and things are kind of much improved now, and there's more acceptance, and in the States they had the Trump Muslim ban, and all these things are kind of, we are settling now down from all of these things, and maybe now it's going to be easier to have these conversations that we couldn't have had in these past decades because of the tension and how volatile the arguments were at the time.
Wow, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. Each word that all of you said, they're so precious. So thank you so much, Huda, Jehan, Leila, for honoring us with your presence. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, Sabin.
Thank you, Sabin. That was nice. Thank you.